All right, thank you. Well, hi, everybody. This week's video was a little different than others have been, a little more on the philosophical side. I just felt like we're dealing with a story that has so much phenomena, so many phenomenal pieces in it that I just felt like we had to take some time to discuss how it is that we hold stories like this. And I wanted you particularly to know that if for whatever reason you find stories like this hard to wrap your head around or hard to believe, certainly in a literal sense, then you're in good company in the theological tradition and not just amongst the heretical tradition. So if you find yourself doubting or wondering, welcome to the club. Okay, so let me begin by just asking, first of all, I need one of these handouts. Let me ask if you had any questions. I did get one over email that I will rehearse with you in a minute, but did you have any questions about the material we covered in the video or the text itself? Well, frankly, I find that amazing. Maybe the general question, what were you talking about? Yeah. I'm sorry? It was dense. It was dense. Okay. Or I was dense. One or the other. Yes, Jan. Okay.
I don't have a specific question. I can't even think of one specific question. So I'll see as the hour goes along.
Okay. All right.
I thought about it a
So
lot.
we have a remark that it was very dense, very intriguing, and somewhat confusing, and maybe to the point where we can't quite articulate the question, but it raises a lot of questions. And I am fine with that. That's how I feel every time I read Kierkegaard and Barth. And I don't read Lessing very often, but this is a tradition that's very dense, and we want to appreciate that. Jen, could you make sure Les gets a handout? Thank you. Okay. One of the questions that came up over email was, I did a little bit of comparison between Matthew's account of the Transfiguration and Luke's account. And the question was why I didn't do so with Mark, the Gospel of Mark, in that account. And it's in Mark chapter 9. The reason I tacked toward Luke is because we have studied it together so recently that I thought it might still be fresh in your minds. Quite an assumption on my part that these things stay fresh in our minds. But so I did a little more comparison between Matthew and Luke than I did with Matthew and Mark. And so when I go over the outline a little bit with you, I'll make some notations about the way in which Matthew's story is like and is unlike Mark's story. But let's just begin by reading it from Matthew's Gospel. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John. Let me remark that that's an interesting thing. Not that James and John are brothers. We've known that for some time. But there's almost the assumption here that James is a more well-known name and that John has to be identified as the brother. That's not how we generally approach it. And it may speak to the fact that Matthew may be writing for a Christian community centered in Jerusalem, because in the in the book of Acts, we read that James was the head of the church in Jerusalem. So this might be just a small little indicator of the audience of Matthew's gospel. Okay, I'll keep reading. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. And from the cloud, a voice said, This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Get up and do not be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. And the disciples asked him, Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? He replied, Elijah is indeed coming and will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but they did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man is about to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them about John the Baptist. Where did that come from? Yeah, okay. It's quite tempting just to read verses 1 through 9 and leave it alone and not include this conversation coming down the hill. That's in fact what the lectionary does whenever this story appears in the Revised Common Lectionary. I think we have to deal with this conversation coming down the hill as well. So I went ahead and included it. Okay, simply from that reading, what questions have you? Yes, ma'am.
Where is it that the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And what is the meaning of that sentence?
All right. So the question is, where do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And what is the meaning of this? Well, if you read the Old Testament, the very last 3 verses of the Old Testament read this way. Remember the teachings of my servant Moses, one of the characters on the hill, right? The statutes and the ordinances that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Lo, that's the word behold, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, so that I will not come and strike the land with a curse. That's the end of the Bible. That's the end of the Bible if you're Jesus, if you're Jewish. If all you have is a Hebrew Bible, those are the last 3 verses. That is why when you go to a Seder dinner, there's usually an extra chair. That's the chair for Elijah, because Elijah must come. We're waiting for Elijah. Okay? Remember, Elijah went off in a fiery chariot. Elijah will return. That is one of the traditions within Jewish belief, and by extension within our tradition, that Elijah must return. Now, Jesus offers a very, very interesting commentary on that belief. And he says 2 things. Elijah will return, and Elijah has already returned. Did you get that? Elijah will return, and Elijah has already returned. Now, when Elijah had already returned, as the last verse tells us, he was speaking of John the Baptizer, whose name is John, not Elijah. Darn. And so when Elijah will return, will he come bearing a name tag that says, "Hi, I'm Elijah. Be good to me. Don't treat me like a prophet." Yeah, is it going to be Elijah, or is it possible that Elijah comes in many forms. Some of your Jewish friends would be happy to tell you that Messiahs come periodically. That would explain, for example, why the book of Isaiah refers to Cyrus, a Persian general, as God's Messiah, because he liberated the people of Israel from Babylonian captivity. The Persians beat the Babylonians. He was the head of the Assyrian army. They beat the Babylonians. And when they did, they freed the people of Israel who had been held in captivity for 70 years and allowed them to go back home. That was the end of the exile. And Isaiah 42 refers to Cyrus in the name of God. God says, Cyrus, my Messiah, my chosen one, my sent one. Okay. So I think within Jewish belief, you can have Elijah show up not as Elijah Smith, the same Elijah that was here, back in the day, but as someone bearing the mantle of the prophet and speaking, which is why even the Elijah story ends with Elijah taking his mantle, putting it on whom? Elisha, who then takes up Elijah's message and continues it. So we think in terms of the singular person, that if Elijah must come, then it's got to be that person, that identity that we associate with the singular person of Elijah. And I think within the tradition, it's a looser interpretation that Elijah is someone who bears the mantle of prophetic speech that shows us how the teachings of Moses mean something for our moment now. You could call Martin Luther King Jr. Elijah. And I don't think you would be violating the biblical tradition by doing that. So it's that somebody who comes with the anointing to speak truth in the manner of Elijah, which is interesting, because if we're waiting for the Messiah to return, would it be a Messiah that comes wearing a name tag saying, "Hi, I'm Jesus"? Or are we waiting on someone who will speak a liberative word at the right moment?
To whom?
And to whom? And would we say then faithfully, Christ has come? So, I think we're getting into, if you thought the presentation was confusing, this conversation is somewhat confusing, right? So Elijah has come. It was John the Baptizer. And here's what's interesting. They did to him what they wish. So when Elijah comes, humans still have agency. They can accept or reject. They can kill, as they did John the Baptizer. It's not like a Marvel superhero that comes and, has these magical powers that if you try to hurt them, the joke's on you. This guy turns green and becomes the Hulk and smashes you. It's not that. It's like, if you want to kill a prophet, kill a prophet. You can do it. It's wrong. You shouldn't do it. It's condemnable. It's damnable. It's awful. But it's not impossible. You can do that. You want to put the Christ to death? You can do that. You shouldn't. It's terrible. You're guilty for it, but you can do it. Jesus is not going to call down 10,000 angels to rescue him. So it's kind of curious that on that way down the hill, then we've got a couple of really deep, hard to imagine conversations. The spirit of Elijah lives on and comes through different ways, one of which was John the Baptizer, one of which hasn't been seen yet as they're coming down the mountain. It is not wrong of the scribes to say that Elijah will come. the spirit of Elijah will come. And I have to use the phrase spirit of Elijah because obviously John the Baptizer was John, not Elijah. So to say that Elijah has come in John the Baptizer means that Elijah is more than that historic person. And that's another way of thinking about the Christ. So that's a curious conversation, isn't it? And I just made it curiouser and curiouser, I'm sure. Yeah. Do you have another question?
If there was an understanding that Elijah's spirit was with John the Baptist, then also with Jesus, who at the time was only partially known to the disciples. So they could end up interpreting it that way too.
Okay, so the question is, if the spirit of Elijah was in John the Baptizer, and
Jesus didn't take up his mantle until John was arrested.
can you say that about Jesus as well? Was the spirit of Elijah in Jesus? I think you absolutely can. And I think your other point, Beryl, in most of the Gospels, I haven't done a close study of this particular moment, but it's when John is arrested that Jesus starts his public ministry. So there is a passing of the mantle, as it were, from John to Jesus. Yeah. So yeah, sure. I think in Matthew's Gospel, particularly twice in once in particular in the Sermon on the Mount, in chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus says, "Don't think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So yes, absolutely. Jesus is the new Moses and Jesus is the new Elijah. That's what it means to live in that spirit. Yeah. Yeah, I think Matthew has a very vivid, living sense of who these persons are. Do we have anything, Jen?
We just had Betty would have liked the lecture to have been longer.
Oh, Betty, you're so weird. Okay, Betty would have liked for the lecture to have been longer. And everybody else in the room is seizing up with anxiety. I can't get them under 30 minutes. Have you noticed? It's always 31 and 30 seconds or something like that. And I honestly, I just have a little outline. Well, I mean, I put together the keynote thing and then I just go. And I just hope to goodness that it's somewhere around 30 minutes. And when I'm done, it's like, oh, it's somewhere around 30 minutes. But if I had a show, I'd be running into the commercials and my producers would kill me. Okay. Any other questions about the story that we just read? All right. Yes, let's.
I've heard the expression a thin place. Would this whole episode be considered one of those thin places?
So Les is making reference to the phrase a thin place and asked if this whole episode would be considered that. And I think that's exactly what it is. But to me, the more important question is not whether our phrase, a thin place, whether this scripture meets that, but rather let this scripture be the standard and let it define what a thin place is. This scripture tells us that there's a way of envisioning the glory of God and that it can be scary and that there's a right response and a wrong response. And the point is to listen to the Son of Man who is being revealed to us in glory right there. The Son of God who's being revealed to us in glory right there. Both of those titles is at work in this story. Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man going down the mountain. The voice out of the cloud refers to Jesus as God's beloved Son. So this story is the standard. We don't want to put this story into a category that we created. We want to take our category and put it into this story because this story is our standard. If that's a small kind of eruption there. Yes, ma'am.
Well, and this obviously is a very important story because it's in very important place, right? So so could it be said that the point here is within that tradition to pull together Moses and Elijah and relate them to Jesus, to see that is where this is headed, and then kind of reiterate the baptism that
Right.
came down and put it all together for the sake of the disciples, so that they begin to see a picture.
Okay, stop. You're adding layers to that question. Let's let me interpret it for our studio audience. So this story appears in all three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And Beryl's asking, could the point of the story be to associate Jesus with Elijah and Moses? Let's start there. And sure, absolutely. And I would add that in traditional Jewish thought, what was original is more important, and what follows is secondary, important insofar as it reflects the original. So that's the father is one thing. You're the son of Joseph, so you're Joseph's son, and but you point back to Joseph as being the standard, and you're a son of Joseph. So your job is to live up to Joseph. And I just picked the name Joseph out of the hat. All right. That's why there's so much appeal to tradition. In this story, you could argue that Jesus supersedes Moses and Elijah. When the voice says, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." And then they looked up and saw no one but Jesus alone. So at least for the disciples, that is kind of a culmination, not a spin-off, but a culmination of the law and the prophets, which makes sense then for the Sermon on the Mount. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. This is fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So great honor in that tradition, but the story ultimately becomes about Jesus, not Jesus vis-a-vis, insofar as he lives within the tradition of Moses and Elijah, but he fulfills that tradition. You see the difference there? I know, sounds like supersessionism, doesn't it? Driving me crazy.
Let me argue back a little bit.
Okay, I will let you, but then I'm going to turn you off because there are other people. Yes, ma'am.
Because I'm going back to, I mean, I think you're right in the long run, but let's remember that the audience is the disciples, right? And so it's staged for them to understand this person that they are following.
Right.
And so, and they need that because in the following paragraph, they're still stuck on why did the scribes say Elijah must come first? So it was really important for them to see, as you say, the traditional figures, and then the final culmination that they needed that.
Yeah. And I'm not trying to imply the opposite of that. That yes, the Moses and Elijah are signatory characters that represent the tradition in which they live, the tradition of faith, the tradition that shows us how to please God and live as God's people on earth. And Jesus fulfills that. So there is that kind of, I would still use the word culmination as opposed to a spin-off. And that's but absolutely, I mean, look, of all the characters of history, you got Elijah and Moses, these are two, right? And they certainly represent the law and the prophets. They're just kind of paradigmatic, symbolic of those two traditions. So yes, I would agree with you in that respect. They're certainly not randomly chosen, and they're certainly not presented as just kind of passing figures from stories. They are signatory figures. Okay. So going back to the question I got online, asking about Mark's gospel, let's look at some of the differences between Matthew, Luke, and Mark's telling of the Transfiguration, because it'd be kind of interesting if one of them were the constant outlier, but that's not the case. So when I'm done, we're going to circle back and ask the question, why do we have 3 different presentations of the same event? What do the differences signify? So in Matthew, it says after 6 days. That's exactly what Mark says. But in Luke's gospel, it says after 8 days. Maybe Luke didn't do math. I don't know. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus goes through what the literal Greek term is metamorpho, from which we get our transliterated word metamorphosis. So in Matthew's gospel, that word that's translated transfigured is metamorpho. It appears in Romans chapter 12, one of the verses that many people love to memorize. Do not be conformed to this world any longer, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's the same verb. Transformed, transfigured, metamorpho. Jesus metamorphosizes. In Matthew's gospel, it says that Jesus' face shone like the sun. You remember when we looked at Luke, literally it says Jesus' face became other, hetero. Remember that word hetero can be either a prefix like heterosexual, or it can be an adjective in itself. His face became other. Most translations simply make that his face changed. So we have his face changing in Luke. Mark does not mention Jesus' face. Matthew says his face shone like the sun. So that's to me a significant difference in describing what ultimately may be indescribable. Matthew says that Jesus' clothes became bright as the light. So he uses an analogy to talk about the brightness of it. Luke says Jesus' clothes flashed white. The verb there is dazzled, blinged, bright. And again, Mark doesn't mention the face, only that Jesus' clothes became dazzling white, such as no fuller on earth could whiten them. So, when you watch a biblical movie, when you see somebody in a pure white gown, that's a fiction. Can you imagine how dusty the world was and how difficult it is to attain pure white? That's why fullers are known throughout scripture as being somebody who just works real hard to make something white. But average people who walk all day long and have to wash their hands and their feet before they have a meal and so forth, they're not going to have the pearly white robes. Maybe Caesar, who might put on one white robe today, and meanwhile half the slavey class are washing the other robes to make sure he can have a white one for the next day. But this was no small attainment at that time to have a pure white robe. And that's why it's such a significant feature is its clothes, dazzling white. Even if they're not shiny, the fact that they are so white was beyond comprehension in some ways. In Matthew, Elijah, Moses, and Jesus are speaking together. In Luke, they're speaking together about his exodus, which he is about to take in Jerusalem. Mark is the same as Matthew on that. He just has Elijah, Moses, and Jesus speaking, but doesn't tell us what the content is. In Luke, the disciples are fighting sleep. Kind of an interesting thing. It almost reminds us of the scene in the garden when Jesus is praying and they're fighting sleep. They're fighting sleep, but they didn't quite fall asleep, and therefore they saw this. In Matthew and Mark, neither of them mention the disciples' sleepiness. It's not a part of the story. In Matthew and Mark also, after Peter speaks up and says, I'm going to build 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah, then the voice comes. And so it seems like a smackdown in some ways. Like, I shouldn't use the word smackdown after what we saw Sunday night. It seems like an abrupt stopping in some ways, like, I'm going to cut you off right there. Listen to Jesus. Stop talking, right? But in Luke's story, as Moses and Elijah are departing, then Peter speaks. In Matthew and Mark, you get the idea that Peter ruined everything, because after he spoke, the voice said, listen to my son, and they looked up, and suddenly Jesus was by himself. In Matthew, it's a bright cloud. I'm not sure how a bright cloud overshadows. I mean, it could be a whitening, that kind of an overshadowing, that a blazing, as opposed to, when we get a cloud and it's a darkening. It's a bright cloud. Mark and Luke only talk about a cloud. And then you ask the question, what were they terrified about? Because in each story, Peter, James, and John get terrified. And in Mark, they're terrified before the cloud, before the voice. They're terrified when they see Jesus changing and becoming dazzling white and in front of them. In Luke, they're terrified at the cloud. And in Matthew, they're terrified when the voice speaks. So what does that tell you? It just might tell you a little something about whether the writers put more emphasis on what we hear or on what we see. I'm not real sure, but those are interesting differences. Yes, Les.
Terrified or utterly astonished?
Yes. So he's asking, terrified or utterly astonished? It's an interesting word. And in my blog, when I translate this word, I make it afeared. Afeared. And I do that because my grandfather would use terms like that, right? He was just walking, or he was just whistling, and so forth. And his way of keeping the verb there. This is the word phobos at the root, phobos. So if you have a phobia, it's a fear. That's the root of this word. But fear for us is either a noun or an adjective. And this is the verbal form of it. And we don't really have that. We have frightened, but it's passive. So it might be was frightened. But we don't have even the word afeared. It's not quite a passive verb. We don't have a real close English one-to-one kind of corresponding word there. But just remember, when you see that term, it's connected to the word that is commonly translated as a noun, fear. Fear fell among them. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. That's the word there too. Okay. So yeah, but your question, Les, is, what is the relationship between fear and awe? Are they similar? Are they the same? Are they connected? Are they different? I think in the presence of God, they're hard to distinguish. And so if you wanted to translate this, filled with awe or utterly dismayed or something like that, I think these are all words incapable of expressing the feeling. And so we do our best. Yes, sir.
Well, fear can drive you to your knees. Awe can drive you to your knees.
Yes. Fear and awe can, if you're watching someone full of fear or awe, I don't know if you can tell the difference. But we'll just have to leave it at that for right now. We have other things to cover, okay? In Matthew, Jesus says to Peter, James, and John, by the way, do not be afraid. He says that to them. He doesn't say that in Luke. He doesn't say it in Mark. And in Matthew, Jesus tells them to say nothing. And that happens in Mark as well. Jesus commands them to say nothing on the way down the hill. Say nothing about this until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. In Luke, Jesus doesn't command it. They just don't tell anybody until later. They said nothing to anyone. So it's just kind of a curious question, is what these differences tell you when you read the story. It might tell you a little something about the writer and how the writer of that particular gospel experiences faith, experiences awe or fear, experiences the resurrected presence of Christ in their own life. It might tell you how the writer anticipates the audience needs to hear it in order to understand what's going on. I mean, imagine if you were to try to describe a phenomenal experience, much of which lies outside of normal human action, right? Human experience. But you're trying to describe it to someone who wasn't there and help them to feel what you felt, to know what you know, to believe what you believe from it. You know, you find the inadequacy of words, and you almost have to use some kind of imagery or analogy or something that startles in order to kick us out of our normal mode. This was not a normal thing. This is not something you saw last week. This is something that changes your life because it happened and you can't quite explain it. To me, that's what the gospel writers are up against in a number of stories, but particularly in this story. How do you explain the inexplicable? How do you describe the indescribable? And so you end up with things like John the Baptist was Elijah, and Elijah's coming again and appeared on the mountain and then disappeared. That's what Elijah does. You know, and you're just full of things that a skeptical person could go and dismiss, and probably does. All right. So anyway, that's a little comparison there. If you've got a parallel Bible that can put them all side by side, it's kind of fun to look at that. But then you have to ask the question, what do these differences mean? Okay, let's look at a few notes. Here's something I think is very interesting about the story. Look in verse 3. It begins, it's maddeningly not translated well in the New Revised Common Lectionary. It says, suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Do you see that? I think that's verse 3. All right. That word suddenly is the word arao. And it is often translated in your great biblical stories as behold or lo. Okay? It's the story in the Christmas story. It's the word in the Christmas story. Behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy. Behold. All right, so let's go to the Christmas story for just a minute. And I know this is Luke, not Matthew, but hang with me for a second. In this story, the angel says to the shepherds, behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy. Okay, so the word behold is called a particle. It's actually the imperative form of the verb look, or rao, look. And so to look, to behold, when it comes in the imperative like that, is more than just, you know, look around you. No, it's a focusing, right? Look, behold. That's the word translated suddenly in the New Revised Standard Version, which I think is a very poor translation, because almost every other time that word appears, it will be behold. So what's the difference? Well, behold is this. The narrator is telling you a story of them, what happens there. And suddenly the narrator comes around the camera and looks at it and says, behold, and talks to you, the audience, directly. Just like the angel was talking to the shepherds directly. Only this is the narrator breaking character from behind the camera and coming in front of them and saying, look, they saw. And the word saw there is the very same verb. So now you get to do what they were doing. They saw Elijah and Moses conversing with Jesus. And oh, by the way, look, if you look, you'll see Elijah and Moses conversing with Jesus. You're not on top of a mountain, you're reading a book. But this book is telling you, behold this. This is one of those moments when the narrator jumps out of character into the story and talks directly to you, because who's the recipient of this imperative? So an imperative typically is in the second person plural, or the second person voice. So the implied recipient is you. So if Jesus is talking to someone and uses the imperative voice, he's talking to them. He's not talking about things in general. He's talking to them. Says, go, show yourself to the priest. That's an imperative to that person. And it could be easily translated, you go, show yourself to the priest. If the narrator uses the imperative voice, which is what this particle behold is, then he's talking to you. So you get to be like Peter, James, and John. And you get to behold. You get to look at what they looked at. I think that's a marvelous connection. So they saw, and behold, now you see Jesus, Elijah, Moses speaking together. A glimpse of glory. They got it directly in the story. You get it indirectly through the gospel. But you can participate in it. Why? Because Jesus is still alive. And if you don't believe in resurrection, none of this stuff makes sense. None of it. It's the premise. It's the premise of this story. Moses is dead, y'all. If you don't believe in resurrection, this story doesn't make sense. That's gross. He would be just ruined by now, right? Okay, so I think that's an interesting thing. I think the relationship between the voice speaking out of the cloud in this story and the voice that comes out of the heavens in the baptism story, which Beryl mentioned earlier, the words are exactly the same. The preface is a little different. In one, he's speaking out, the voice comes out of the clouds, and the other, the voice comes out of the heavens. But the words, this is my son, the beloved, are exactly the same in Greek, in English, everything. But our story has a little addendum that says, listen to him. So that's the difference in this story. Yes?
Is the suddenly in that sentence the same word as it is with suddenly there appeared, suddenly a bright cloud, but that also be old and bright cloud?
Well, that's a great question. So Beryl is asking if in that sentence, which would be verse 5, correct? She's asking if the word suddenly there, yeah, suddenly a bright cloud. It is, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. Yep. So again, yeah. So in this instance, beholding is you hear this voice, right? Behold, this voice. This is my son, the beloved, in whom, and actually that's a aorist verb, in whom I delighted. Listen to him. Anyway, yeah, so good point. Yeah, I really wish the New Revised Standard Version would press themselves toward consistency with certain terms like that. That one and the other term, Deo, that I've mentioned a million times, doesn't show in this story. It's a little maddening to me. Okay, so in the extra verses, Jesus orders them to be silent until his resurrection. Till his resurrection. If that were in the Gospel of Mark, and it is, in the Gospel of Mark, people like to say, oh, that's the messianic secret. You're not supposed to say anything about who Jesus really is until the resurrection. I don't ascribe to that phrase or that way of thinking about the Gospel of Mark. But I do like how Karl Barth describes this moment. He's not talking about this moment, but what he says can describe this moment. He said, the impossible possibility of all possibilities, as the abyss into which no man can leap, yet into which we all do leap. That's his description of resurrection. And I'm going to just say, if you don't believe in some meaning of resurrection, this story cannot make sense. It almost has to be described as some kind of delirious moment or some kind of fictional event, perhaps with good intention, but not real. But if you believe in resurrection, all bets are off, because now you believe in the impossible possibility. Oh, how did he put it? The impossible possibility of all possibilities.
But what does he say after that?
That's the abyss. So he's going back to this Kierkegaardian language, right? As the abyss into which no man can leap, yet into which we all do leap. And his point there is that you can't do it with your own cleverness, but you can do it through union with Christ. It's an act of grace. So we do all leap into this belief in resurrection, but you can't get there by figuring it out. You can't do it. Right? That offends the modern mind, but oh well. Okay. I think the other things that I wanted to, I think I slayed Janice with that last comment. Sorry.
Bodily resurrection?
I don't know if I said the words literal and bodily when I talked about resurrection, but I did talk about resurrection. Oh gosh. Okay, I apologize in advance. I think it could include reincarnation. I think it could include John the Baptist is Elijah. So the spirit of Elijah lives on in somebody who's not Elijah. That makes no sense unless once you bought into resurrection, it's like, oh, sure. Why can't the spirit of Elijah rise in John the Baptizer? Yeah, so I'm not going to tell you what to think exactly about resurrection. I think too often when the emphasis is put on the bodily resurrection of Jesus, it's almost like putting a block on your shoulder and saying, I dare you to knock that off. It's almost like telling us if you don't believe that, then you're not a real Christian. I think if you look at the resurrection stories in the gospel, So I'm not being post-biblical here. I'm not trying to be extra biblical. I'm trying to take my cue from the scriptures. If you look at the 4 resurrection stories in the Gospels, let me ask you, what literal facts about the resurrection do all 4 Gospels share in common? There aren't many. It's different people going to the tomb. It's different words being said. It's different events in which they see the Christ. It's Jesus corporeal in one moment, eating a piece of fish, and not really corporeal in the next, because he kind of enters the room with a locked door. All of these things would say that the emphasis on the literal bodily resurrection, I think, is actually trying to address something other than literal bodily resurrection. I think it's trying to assure those of us who only know life in literal bodily terms that we too will participate in resurrection. And so I just want to say to you that I think the resurrection is a premise for most of these biblical stories, New Testament stories particularly, but Jesus would argue for all the stories. And yet I think the way we named believing in the resurrection has been too constricted. I hope that makes sense. And I hope that reincarnation line didn't throw you off. Yes.
All of this calls to mind various sessions I've had with Greek counselors who say that the experience of death, the loss of a loved one, isn't finite. It's not over. That there is much that carries over after that, and they will come back to you time and time again.
Yeah. So Les is mentioning conversations with grief therapy counselors who will talk about how someone who has physically passed will continue to visit you over and over again, and not necessarily in spooky ways, but in meaningful ways, right? And intensely personal ways that if you try to describe how you feel and how you experience that to somebody else, you will sound like a lunatic. But it's still meaningful and still powerfully and true. Yes. So I hope I haven't inadvertently thrown us off course. Let me see. Do we have any questions going on, Jen? No? All right. You got a curious wry grin on your face. Are you?
Everyone's kind of smiling along.
Thank you, studio audience. Okay. Any other particular questions that y'all want to raise or ask here? Okay. So let me just throw this to you. Okay. So we have the story presented to us as a story of something that really happened, right? James, John, Peter, right there, seeing it with their own eyes. And now you get to behold it through the written text. And on the way down, as Jesus is leading them down out of the mountain, Jesus commanded them, tell, I don't know how it's translated in the New Revised. Oh yeah, it's translated well. Tell no one about the vision until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. The vision. This is the only use of this word outside of the book of Acts in the New Testament. And in Acts, it describes Moses staring at the burning bush as a vision. It's used several times in the book of Acts, almost always for what we would call a vision something that somebody just kind of sees maybe in their head, but it's real enough nonetheless. That's the word Jesus uses to describe what Peter, James, and John just saw in a story that sounded to us like it was as real as a woman filling a basin with water and washing the dirt off Jesus' feet. And yet Jesus refers to it as a vision. I don't know what quite to make of that. But I think it's kind of curious that maybe our sense, we tend to want things to either be literally true or fiction. Because when you walk into the library, on that side it's fiction and on that side is nonfiction. And these are stories that people made up, and this is research and boring stuff. This is exciting stuff, right? Fiction and nonfiction, we have a divisive line there. And the fact that this can be presented as something that really does happen and called a vision at the same time makes me want to think that at least in the first century biblical world, that's not such a thick line. That you can have a collective vision that's real, but not necessarily fact, not necessarily verifiable in the way that other things are. Which brings us back to Lessing. Lessing said, in history, we try to look at verifiable facts. How do you get from that mentality to believing in something like the claim that John the Baptist was Elijah, that a dead person appeared on the mountain, that Jesus will rise from the dead, that Jesus is God's beloved son? How do you get from this to there? And Karl Barth's answer is, you can't. But the gift of grace, this union with Christ, is how you do it. And that's the dramatic point at which we're going to leave this conversation. Now, you're welcome, America. I think I have blown all my good points and have nothing left to preach on Sunday, so I may start my sabbatical 3 weeks early. Who knows? I need to sign off because it's been a good hour. And then thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we'll do it again next week.